The sun was sinking low, casting long, jagged shadows across the decimated streets of what had once been a bustling city. A faint breeze carried the stench of decay, mixing with the remnants of gasoline and fire. The world had already changed. And the worst part? It happened overnight. Maggie stood at the edge of a shattered window in the old office building she'd taken refuge in. Her heart pounded in her chest, every breath a struggle against the thick tension that had settled in the air. Outside, the world had been swallowed by chaos. The cities, once symbols of human achievement, were now graveyards of shattered glass, overturned cars, and the sickening moans of the undead. She pressed a trembling hand against the cool glass, her fingers leaving smudges as she stared out at the remains of civilization. A few months ago, this had been a thriving metropolis. Now, it was nothing but a hunting ground for things that used to be human. And she was still alive, barely. The radio crackled to life in her hand, the static hissing louder than before. Her eyes darted to it with a mix of hope and dread, as if waiting for some miracle to break through the chaos. It had been a month since she'd last heard anything resembling human voices. No broadcasts, no news. The world felt so alone now. Anyone out there? Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper in the vast emptiness that surrounded her. The silence stretched on for what seemed like eternity. Then, suddenly, a faint voice came through the static. "Maggie? Maggie, are you there?" It was a man's voice. Familiar. Her heart lurched. "Rick? Is that you?" A pause. Then, "Yeah. Yeah, it's me. Listen, we need to move. The city, it's not safe anymore." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Rick was the last person she had expected to hear from. He had been with her when everything fell apart, and they had gotten separated in the panic of that first night when the dead rose. She hadn't seen him since. There was a flicker of hope, quickly smothered by a pang of fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is the city overrun?" "Worse," Rick said, his voice shaking with urgency. "The first wave, those were just the beginning. The numbers, they're multiplying faster than we can handle. We're not safe here anymore. We need to leave, Maggie. It's not just the dead you need to worry about now." Maggie froze, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" "The survivors, they're getting desperate. People are becoming monsters, too. It's not just the walkers, it's what the fear, the hunger, does to people." The hairs on the back of Maggie's neck stood on end. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. The world was changing again, and not in any way that could give her peace. "We have to go, Maggie. Right now. They're closing in." She didn't hesitate. She couldn't. The decision was made for her. She had no choice but to fight, to survive. With a shaking hand, she turned the radio off and dropped it into her backpack. She had been holding on to the hope of rescue, but now it seemed more like a distant dream. The only way to stay alive was to keep moving. The echo of distant screams reached her ears, and Maggie's blood ran cold. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a figure stumbling into the dim light of the alley outside. It was a woman. Her face, once full of life, was now twisted in an unnatural snarl, her eyes glazed with a hunger that chilled Maggie to the core. The woman was dragging herself forward, one foot dragging limply behind her. Without thinking, Maggie grabbed her bag and shoved it onto her shoulders. She darted away from the window and made her way to the back of the building. The air was thick with dread, as though the world was holding its breath. She needed to get out of here, fast. The building wasn't safe. The old office had been a sanctuary of sorts for Maggie since the outbreak, but now it was just another ticking clock, counting down to the inevitable. She had seen enough to know that nothing stayed safe for long. Creeping through the back hallways, her footsteps were silent against the cracked tiles, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She passed the elevator and headed for the stairs. The thud of her boots on the concrete felt deafening. The sound of movement on the floor above sent her pulse racing. She wasn't alone. Another survivor? Or something far worse? Maggie didn't wait to find out. She sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, her legs burning with the effort. She wasn't sure where she was headed, only that she had to get out. Reaching the roof access door, she shoved it open and stepped out into the cold air, the wind biting her skin. The roof was empty, offering a wide view of the city. She paused for a moment, taking in the destruction that had once been the heart of civilization. Smoke rose from fires burning in the distance, and the sounds of gunfire echoed from nearby blocks. But Maggie had no time to mourn. She turned and headed for the fire escape at the far side of the building. She wasn't alone in this fight. But she was certain now more than ever, whatever lay ahead, it was going to be a fight for survival like no other. The world outside wasn't just dangerous, it was a war zone. And Maggie had only one goal, to stay alive, no matter what. The fire escape rattled beneath Maggie's feet as she descended into the dark alleyway below. The cold, dry air scraped at her skin, and the shadows felt almost alive, creeping, shifting, waiting. Every step she took was measured, deliberate. She couldn't afford to make a sound. Not now. Her mind was racing with Rick's words. The city's not safe anymore. Desperation lingered in the air like a heavy fog. She could feel it in the back of her throat, the taste of fear mixing with the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her limbs. But there was no time to rest. No time for hesitation. Not anymore. The sounds of the city were all around her, the distant groan of collapsing buildings, the ominous growl of the undead, the panic-driven shouts of survivors, voices that were slowly becoming fewer and fewer. Maggie had learned the hard way that it wasn't just the zombies that were dangerous anymore. There were people out there too, people who would kill for food, for shelter, for anything that could give them even a moment's relief from the crushing despair. She rounded a corner and froze. Ahead, a group of walkers were stumbling through the wreckage of a once bustling street. Their broken bodies moved with a sickening slowness, each dragging itself forward with an insatiable hunger. They were mindless. Dangerous. Relentless. She instinctively ducked back behind the crumbling remnants of a storefront. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she pressed herself flat against the brick, willing her breath to steady. Stay calm, she told herself. Don't panic. The walkers, oblivious to her presence, continued their hunt for whatever they could consume. Maggie held her breath, praying the wind wouldn't carry her scent in their direction. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wet, dragging footsteps of the zombies. Minutes passed. Finally, when she felt the danger was manageable, Maggie pulled herself up into a crouch and slowly, carefully, began to edge along the narrow alleyway. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. The entire world had turned into a minefield of traps, each moment a countdown to disaster. She had to find Rick. The hope of seeing a familiar face, of hearing the voice of someone who remembered what it was like before, was the only thing that kept her going. She couldn't fight this battle alone. Turning down another street, Maggie's eyes caught the flicker of movement ahead. She paused, holding her breath. This time, it wasn't a zombie. No, it was a person. A silhouette standing motionless in the middle of the street, almost blending into the darkened surroundings. It was a man, tall, with a long coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His posture was rigid, tense, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Maggie's pulse quickened. Was this a survivor? Or a predator? Hey, she called, her voice low but firm. She could feel the weight of every word, the gravity of the situation making even the smallest sound feel like a risk. The figure turned slowly, his face shadowed by the low light. For a moment, Maggie's heart leapt in her chest. He looked almost like Rick. But as the man stepped into the dim glow of a nearby streetlight, she saw the truth. This wasn't Rick. His eyes were cold and distant, a predatory gleam in them that made Maggie's skin crawl. His hand rested on the hilt of a knife strapped to his waist. "Who's there?" the man asked, his voice gruff and low, his accent thick. He didn't move a muscle, but the threat in his tone was unmistakable. "You shouldn't be out here, girl. You might not like what you find." Maggie froze. Don't panic. Stay calm. I'm just looking for someone, she replied cautiously, her mind working over the next steps. Her fingers grazed the edge of the pistol holstered at her side. Have you seen anyone else alive? Maybe a man, short hair, a bit older than me? The man stared at her for a long, unnerving moment. Then, without a word, he turned his back to her, walking toward the alley on the far side of the street. He never looked back. Maggie didn't wait to see what he was doing. She pressed herself against the nearest wall, sinking into the shadows, watching him with narrowed eyes. He wasn't following her. He wasn't trying to attack. But something about him felt wrong. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to keep moving, but she had to know, had he seen Rick? Was he a threat? The man paused at the entrance of the alley and then turned his head slightly, glancing over his shoulder. For a split second, Maggie could have sworn he was smiling, an eerie, unsettling grin that didn't belong on a human face. Careful, girl, he called out without turning around. The dead aren't the only things you need to worry about now. People, they'll tear you apart. Without another word, he disappeared into the darkness of the alley. Maggie stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her mind. The dead aren't the only things you need to worry about. She had already known that. But hearing it spoken aloud, from the mouth of someone who seemed too dangerous to trust, made the truth hit even harder. She could feel the urgency now. Rick was out there somewhere, and time was running out. She couldn't waste another minute. Her heart heavy with caution, Maggie stepped away from the wall, scanning the area one last time before continuing her search. The city had become a twisted version of itself, a place where the line between the living and the dead was beginning to blur. And in this new world, trust had become a rare commodity. She had to find Rick, and fast. But in this place, she couldn't afford to trust anyone. Not anymore. You said. Maggie's footsteps quickened, the crunch of debris beneath her boots sending sharp echoes down the desolate streets. Her mind raced. She had to find Rick. The shadows were thickening, the dying light of the sun casting everything in a pale, eerie glow. Her eyes darted from one crumbling building to the next, as though expecting an ambush at every corner. The man she'd encountered earlier haunted her thoughts. People, they'll tear you apart. His words were still fresh in her mind, a warning that she couldn't afford to ignore. In this world, everyone had become a potential threat. Trust was a luxury that no one could afford anymore. Maggie turned down another street, her gaze scanning every shadow. She thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye and froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she instinctively reached for her weapon, fingers brushing the cool metal of her pistol. Was it another walker? Or had the man returned to track her down? Her heart pounded in her chest, every second stretching into eternity. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the doorway of a nearby building. Not a zombie, but a figure, a woman, tall and thin, crouching in the shadows. Her face was obscured by a hood, and she appeared to be watching Maggie intently, her body tense, ready to spring into action. Maggie didn't move, keeping her hand steady on her weapon. Stay calm, she told herself. Stay calm and think. The woman didn't speak, didn't make a sound. She simply stared, her eyes filled with a cold calculation. In that moment, Maggie couldn't tell if the woman was friend or foe. But one thing was certain, this wasn't someone to underestimate. The woman took a slow step forward, keeping her body low. Her fingers hovered near the knife strapped to her leg. She hadn't seen Maggie's weapon yet, but Maggie knew it was only a matter of time. Who are you? Maggie called out, her voice steady but laced with caution. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. What do you want? For a moment, the woman didn't answer. She simply tilted her head, as if evaluating Maggie. Then, with a quiet, almost amused smile, she replied, I could ask you the same thing. Maggie's hand tightened around her gun. She wasn't about to play games with this stranger. I'm just looking for someone. A man, about my height, short hair. Maybe you've seen him? The woman's expression softened slightly, as if contemplating the question. A lot of people are looking for someone out here. Most of us are just trying to survive. Maggie didn't like the sound of that. Survival in this world had become a game of predators and prey. And the woman's words sounded like she was ready to play. "I don't have time for games," Maggie said, her voice hardening. "I'm looking for someone. If you know where he is, tell me. I don't want trouble." The woman stepped out of the doorway and into the light, revealing more of her face. She wasn't much older than Maggie, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. The cold smile never left her lips. "Trouble," the woman repeated, her voice light. "Honey, trouble is all there is. You've been living under a rock if you haven't figured that out by now." Maggie's mind raced, her grip on her weapon tightening. This wasn't a conversation she could afford to prolong. She needed to get moving, find Rick, and stay ahead of whatever dangers lurked in the streets. "Listen," Maggie said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not interested in a fight. I'm just trying to survive, like everyone else." The woman's eyes flickered, as if something in Maggie's words had struck a chord. For a moment, she seemed to consider something. Then, without warning, she stepped even closer. "If you're trying to survive," she said quietly, "you'll need more than just a gun. Trust me. It's not the walkers you need to worry about. It's the others, the ones who'll stab you in the back for a can of beans." Maggie felt a cold shiver race down her spine. The woman's tone was so casual, so matter-of-fact, as if she had been through hell and come out on the other side. There was something about her, something in her eyes that told Maggie this wasn't just another survivor. This woman had been changed by the apocalypse in ways Maggie couldn't even begin to understand. "Are you saying I should trust you?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. The woman chuckled, a low, dark sound. "Trust? In this world? You'll learn soon enough, darling. Trust is a death sentence." Maggie didn't like where this conversation was going. She needed information, not cryptic warnings. But there was something about the woman that nagged at her, something that made her hesitate. "I'm just trying to find someone," Maggie said again, more insistent now. "If you know where he is." "Stop," the woman cut her off, her voice sharp. "I know who you're looking for. Rick, right? Short hair, older. He's been seen around here, near the old hospital." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. "Rick." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. She had found a lead. She had a direction. But the woman's next words shattered the fragile hope that had begun to build in Maggie's chest. "He's not alone," the woman continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I'm not sure if he's alive anymore." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman's cold smile returned. "You're not the only one looking for him." And with that, she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Maggie with 1,000 new questions, and a sinking feeling in her gut. Maggie stood there, her mind racing, her body frozen in place. She had a lead, finally, but now, the uncertainty was eating at her. Who could she trust in this new world? And how much longer could she fight to stay alive? The answers seemed farther away than ever. Maggie's heart raced as she turned away from the alley, her mind still reeling from the woman's cryptic warning. "Rick's not alone. I'm not sure if he's alive anymore." The words echoed in her mind, churning in her gut. She had to find him. She had to know what had happened. But the more she thought about it, the more questions piled up, questions she couldn't afford to ask. The old hospital was a few miles away, according to the woman. Maggie knew it was a dangerous place to go, especially with the night quickly closing in around her. The city was darkening with an unnatural kind of silence, broken only by distant moans and the occasional scream. The air felt heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. She had learned to keep her eyes open for danger. Every corner was a threat. Every shadow a potential attacker. It wasn't just the walkers anymore, it was people, too. The survivors who had lost their humanity in the face of fear, hunger, and desperation. But Maggie didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Rick had always been the one to keep her grounded, the one to remind her that there was more to this nightmare than just surviving. She needed to find him. Whatever it took. Her mind drifted back to the words the woman had spoken. "You're not the only one looking for him." What did that mean? Had Rick become some kind of prize? Or was he already gone, a casualty of the chaos that had ravaged everything? Maggie pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. She moved quickly, staying in the shadows, avoiding any unnecessary confrontations. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional shuffling form of the undead. She passed abandoned cars, shattered windows, and wrecked storefronts, each one a grim reminder of what had been lost. As she neared the hospital, the faint smell of decay grew stronger. Her throat tightened as she tried to block out the overwhelming stench. The building loomed ahead, dark and imposing against the night sky. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a place where the last remnants of civilization had been swallowed whole. Maggie approached the hospital cautiously, her senses on high alert. The entrance was blocked by rubble and debris, the glass doors shattered long ago. There were no signs of life outside, but she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. She made her way to a side entrance, a cracked metal door that had been forced open, probably by another survivor. Her fingers brushed the edges of the doorframe, feeling for any signs of recent use. The metal was cold, and she could see faint traces of blood smeared across the concrete floor. Maggie's stomach twisted. Slowly, she stepped inside, her flashlight flicking on. The beam of light danced across the dark hallway, revealing the remnants of what had once been a hospital. Abandoned medical equipment littered the floors. Broken chairs, discarded syringes, empty medicine cabinets. The walls were streaked with grime, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest as she carefully moved forward, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She was aware of every sound, the rustle of her jacket, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the soft shuffle of something, or someone, moving in the distance. "Rick," she called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't want to draw attention, but the silence was unbearable. She had to know if he was here, if he was alive. No answer. The sound of something skittering across the floor caught her attention. She froze, her pulse spiking. Her hand went instinctively to her gun, the cold metal a comforting weight in her grip. The noise came again, louder this time, closer. Her flashlight swung wildly toward the source of the sound, and she caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. For a moment, her heart stopped. A figure, hunched and limping, staggered toward her. Its face was obscured by a dirty cloth, but the unmistakable groaning and shuffling gait told her everything she needed to know. Maggie didn't wait. She raised her gun, taking aim, and fired. The shot rang out, shattering the eerie silence. The walker collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud. Maggie exhaled shakily, lowering her weapon. She moved forward again, her gaze flicking nervously toward the deeper halls of the hospital. There were more in there. She could feel it. The hospital had been abandoned, but it was far from empty. Her flashlight caught something on the floor, a trail of blood leading deeper into the hospital. Her breath hitched in her throat. Rick. Without thinking, Maggie followed the trail, her steps quickening. She passed through the hallways, ignoring the broken windows and abandoned rooms. The blood trail seemed to lead toward the emergency room, and as she pushed through a set of double doors, she came to a chilling stop. The room was a mess, furniture overturned, blood staining the floors, and medical equipment scattered across the floor. In the far corner, a body lay slumped against the wall, motionless. Maggie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to move forward, keeping her gun raised. As she neared the body, she saw something that made her freeze. A blood-stained coat. Short, dark hair. It was Rick. But his body was still. Lifeless. Maggie's heart plummeted into her stomach, the world around her seeming to tilt. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked for any sign of life. No pulse. No breath. Rick was gone. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The world had already taken too much from her. She couldn't break now. But then, a low groan broke the silence. It wasn't Rick. Maggie's head snapped up just as a shadow lunged toward her from the darkness. The figure in the shadows lunged at Maggie with terrifying speed. Instinct kicked in. She barely had time to react, but her training took over. Years of surviving this nightmare flooded her mind in that split second. She twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding the grasping hands that reached for her throat. A harsh breath tore from her lungs as she stumbled backward, her body crashing into the overturned hospital bed. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beams spinning wildly in the darkness, casting fleeting glows across the chaos around her. She barely registered the creature's identity before it was on her again, another walker, its skin gray and bloated, its mouth open in a hungry snarl. It was fast, unnervingly so for something that should have been decomposing. There was no hesitation in its movement, no second thoughts in its empty eyes. Maggie's gun was still in her hand. She fired without thinking, the crack of the shot filling the room, the noise deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the walker in the forehead, the body crumpling to the floor in an instant. Her heart raced as she stared at the fallen corpse, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't have time to linger. Rick's body was still beside her, lifeless, but she couldn't let herself mourn yet. She couldn't afford to. She needed answers. She needed to leave. The hospital had become a trap, a maze of death where every corner could hold another threat. And there was something about the way the walker had attacked, so quick, so relentless, it wasn't like the others. Maggie shook her head, trying to clear the fog that was creeping in from the corners of her mind. She had to focus. She stood, stepping over Rick's body one last time. The blood trail was still there, leading deeper into the hospital. If there were more walkers, or worse, other survivors, she had to be prepared. Every corner could hold another ambush. The woman in the alley had been right, people were just as dangerous as the dead. Her flashlight flickered as she pushed forward, creeping into the darkened hallways. The silence was suffocating now, broken only by the faint sounds of something moving, shuffling, groaning, faint echoes that made her feel like she was being watched. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved through the twisted labyrinth of the hospital, her senses heightened to an almost painful degree. She paused at the entrance of the next corridor, listening carefully. The smell of rot grew stronger here, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. She felt it then, the undeniable sensation of being watched. She wasn't alone. Maggie, a voice rasped from the dark ahead. Her heart skipped. She froze in place, not sure whether she had imagined it or not. The voice had been weak, strained, but it was unmistakable. "Rick," she whispered, her voice trembling. The hope flared in her chest, but it was fragile, like glass ready to shatter. She stepped forward cautiously. "Maggie," the voice called again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. She rounded the corner, her breath caught in her throat. There, slumped against the wall, was a figure, a man, covered in blood, his clothes torn. His eyes were closed, his face pale, but the voice, there was no mistaking it now. "Rick!" Maggie cried, rushing toward him. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. It was weak, faint, but it was there. Rick was alive. Barely. Tears welled up in her eyes as she brushed his hair back from his forehead, her heart swelling with relief. But the relief was short-lived. She could see the blood on him, too much blood. His wounds were deep, and she wasn't sure if he would survive without immediate help. "Rick, stay with me," she said urgently, her voice strained as she pressed her hands to his chest, trying to staunch the flow of blood. "You have to stay awake, okay? Just stay with me." Rick's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her, his gaze unfocused. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice rough and hoarse. I'm sorry." Maggie shook her head, brushing a tear from her cheek. No, don't say that. You're going to make it. Just hold on." His lips parted, and for a moment, Maggie thought he was going to say something more, but then his gaze turned distant, his breathing shallow. She could see the pain in his eyes, the realization that his body was failing him. The sounds of movement reached her ears, and her blood ran cold. She turned toward the source of the noise, her senses alert. There was no time for hesitation. She could hear the unmistakable shuffle of more walkers coming closer, drawn to the noise. She was running out of time. Maggie moved quickly, pulling Rick's arm over her shoulders, lifting him as best as she could. He was heavier than she remembered, his body limp with exhaustion and blood loss. But she couldn't leave him behind, not like this. "Come on, Rick," she urged, her voice low and fierce. "We're getting out of here." She half-dragged, half-carried him down the hallway, her mind racing as she searched for an escape route. The hospital was a maze, and it seemed every turn she made led her deeper into danger. The sounds of shuffling feet and moaning grew louder, more frantic. The walkers were closing in. As they reached an intersection in the hall, Maggie spotted a fire exit at the end of the corridor. It was their only hope. She picked up the pace, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she stumbled forward. The fire exit was close. She could almost taste freedom. But the sound of a low growl stopped her dead in her tracks. Out of the shadows emerged another figure, this one human. The man from earlier, the one with the knife, stood in her path, a cruel smile twisting his face. "Leaving so soon?" he said, his voice oozing with malice. "You should have known better than to come here, sweetheart." Maggie's grip on Rick tightened, and she instinctively moved to put herself between him and the man. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. "Get out of my way." The man's grin widened, and he stepped closer. "You think I'm going to let you walk out of here alive? You don't know what's out there, girl." The sound of walkers groaning from behind him made Maggie's blood run cold. She was trapped, no choice but to fight. The world had taught her that much. She raised her gun, aiming it straight at his chest. "Move," she said, voice low. "Or I'll make you." "You said." The man eyed the barrel of Maggie's gun with an unsettling calmness. His smirk never faltered, even as the distant groans of the walkers grew louder. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension. Maggie's heart thudded in her chest as she kept her aim steady, unwilling to show even a flicker of uncertainty. Rick's labored breathing was a constant reminder of the urgency. He needed medical help, and they needed to leave before the walkers found them. The man's eyes flicked over her shoulder toward the fire exit, and Maggie could see his thoughts shift, calculating his next move. He wasn't scared. He knew he held the advantage, and in a twisted way, that made him more dangerous. In a world where survival was the only law, people like him thrived on control, on the power they had over others. "I don't want trouble either," he said, his voice a sickening mix of false politeness and cold intent. "But you're standing in my way now. And if you think you can just leave without consequences, well, you've got another thing coming." Maggie didn't flinch. Her finger tightened ever so slightly on the trigger. Her focus sharpened. The man was between her and freedom, and she wasn't going to let him get in the way. Not now. Not after everything she'd been through. "If you want to live, you'll step aside," she said, the calm in her voice betraying the storm of adrenaline surging through her veins. The man chuckled, but it was hollow, like the laughter of someone who had long ago lost their humanity. He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "You're not the first person to try and make demands around here, sweetheart," he sneered. "And you won't be the last. But you're not getting out of here alive. None of us do." Maggie's mind raced. She needed to act before he got any closer. She had no choice but to fight. As the man lunged forward, Maggie didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger, but this time, the shot rang out differently. It didn't feel like it had hit him with the same force. Her hands were shaking. The bullet missed by inches. The man grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. "I told you," he said, as he lunged at her. Maggie barely had time to react, but she kicked out, landing a solid blow to his shin. The man stumbled back with a grunt of pain, his face contorting in anger. But before he could regain his balance, Maggie shoved the gun barrel directly into his chest. She didn't have time for another warning. "Move," she spat. The man's smirk faltered, just for a second. He seemed to weigh his options, fight back, or let her go. Maggie's gaze never wavered from his face. She could see the shift in him. He knew that if he tried anything now, it would cost him. Finally, with a curse under his breath, the man stepped aside, his eyes narrowing with hatred. "You'll regret this," he muttered, backing away slowly. "You'll all regret it." Maggie didn't respond. She had no time to waste on threats. Without looking back, she turned and dragged Rick toward the fire exit, her muscles screaming in protest as she half-carried him down the hallway. The man's voice echoed after her, but she blocked it out, focusing on putting as much distance between herself and him as possible. She shoved the door open with one shoulder, the rusty hinges screeching in protest. Cold air hit her face, sharp and fresh, and for a moment, the feeling of it on her skin made her pause. She hadn't realized how much she needed this: fresh air, freedom, the chance to keep moving. To survive. The night sky stretched above them, clear but dark, the faint glow of a half-hidden moon casting long shadows on the ground. The hospital was a hulking silhouette behind them, a tomb in the distance. They were outside, but the world still felt as dangerous as it ever had. Maggie quickly glanced around, her eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The street was empty, eerily so. It was too quiet. With Rick still leaning heavily against her, she forced herself to keep moving. They couldn't rest. Not yet. She had no idea how far the hospital was from the nearest safe zone, but with every step, the urgency was pressing harder against her chest. She had to find shelter, food, and more importantly, help for Rick. But the streets had become more unpredictable. The dead roamed with no rhyme or reason, and the living, survivors, had become even more dangerous. She kept to the shadows, weaving through the debris-littered streets. The city felt like a graveyard now, everything abandoned, everything broken. Even the wind, which had once carried the sounds of laughter and life, now only whispered of loss. Rick's condition was worsening. His fever was climbing, his body slack in her arms. He wasn't just bleeding, he was losing strength with every passing minute. Maggie's fingers gripped his arm tighter, trying to hold on, trying to keep him from slipping away. She wasn't sure how long they'd been walking when she saw the first flicker of light. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but as they drew closer, the light grew clearer, coming from a small, fortified building on the corner. It looked like a shelter, though it was hard to say whether it was abandoned or occupied by others. The sound of distant moans reached her ears, growing louder. She couldn't afford to be picky. If there were people inside, she needed help, whether they wanted to give it or not. Maggie approached the building cautiously, keeping Rick close, making sure no one could see them until she knew whether it was safe. As she neared the entrance, she heard voices, low, muffled, coming from inside. Her hand hovered near her gun, ready for anything. The walkers weren't the only threat out here. She hesitated for a moment. If there were survivors inside, they could be dangerous. But she had no choice. Rick was slipping. She knocked once, then again, louder this time, hoping someone would answer. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a pair of eyes, narrowed, cautious, but alive. "What do you want?" a man's voice asked from behind the door. Maggie could see the outline of a rifle in his hands. "I need help," she said, voice hoarse. "My friend is hurt. He's not going to make it unless we get some help. Please." There was a pause. Then the door opened wider, and a woman stepped forward, her face hardened but compassionate. "We can help," she said. "But only if you're willing to trade." Maggie didn't hesitate. She would do anything to keep Rick alive. "We'll trade," she said. The woman's eyes narrowed, assessing Maggie and the injured Rick with a practiced gaze. She didn't immediately offer them entry but instead took a long moment to measure the situation. Maggie stood tense, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever it took to keep Rick alive. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Come in," the woman finally said, stepping back to allow them through. "But don't make any sudden moves. We keep a close eye on everyone here. You never know who's truly trustworthy in this new world." Maggie didn't have the energy to argue. She was grateful just for the chance to get Rick inside, away from the streets and the growing horde of walkers that could be closing in on their location. She carefully led him through the doorway, her hand steady despite the panic that bubbled just under the surface. The interior was dimly lit, with the harsh, yellow glow of a single lantern hanging from the ceiling. The space was cramped, rough wooden beams, scattered mattresses, and makeshift barricades stacked around the edges. The faint smell of stale sweat, mildew, and cooking food lingered in the air. Maggie's eyes flicked around, scanning the room for any potential threats. There were about 5 people present, all of them armed to some degree, their eyes wary and cautious. A man with a thick beard and a rifle slung across his chest watched them closely, his arms crossed. He didn't speak, just observed. Maggie's hand instinctively went to her gun, but she reminded herself that this wasn't the time to make enemies. Not when Rick's life hung in the balance. "Set him down here," the woman said, pointing to an old mattress in the corner. Maggie helped Rick down, gently laying him on the thin padding. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. His temperature had skyrocketed, and his wounds were more severe than Maggie had originally realized. The woman knelt beside Rick, inspecting his injuries with practiced precision. "You said he was hurt. This doesn't look like a scratch, lady. This is bad. How long has he been like this?" Maggie swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the surge of fear she felt. "A couple of hours. We were in a hospital. I found him there. He was already like this when I got to him. Please, I need help. I can't do this alone." The woman nodded grimly. "You're right about one thing. You can't do this alone." She stood and called over her shoulder, addressing the man with the rifle. "Hank, get the medical kit." The man didn't hesitate. He crossed the room quickly, grabbing a battered first aid kit from a nearby shelf. It looked old, and the supplies were clearly limited, but it was something. Better than nothing. He handed it to the woman, who immediately set to work. "Don't worry," she said, not looking up. "We've patched up worse. We've got some medicine, some antibiotics left. But, you'll owe us. Nothing's free around here anymore. Especially not your lives." Maggie nodded, though her heart sank a little. She had no idea what kind of trade she was about to enter into, but there was no other choice. She would do anything to save Rick. The woman worked quickly but carefully, her hands steady as she cleaned Rick's wounds, her brow furrowed in concentration. The tension in Maggie's chest only grew. The silence in the room felt oppressive, each second stretching out into what seemed like an eternity. As the minutes passed, the woman began to speak again, though her focus never wavered. "You got anything to trade? Food? Supplies? Weapons?" Maggie glanced around the room, her mind turning over her limited options. She knew she couldn't offer much, she hadn't exactly come prepared for a trade. But she had a few things. A pack of dried beans she'd salvaged from an old store. A half-empty water bottle. Her gun, which she couldn't bear to part with, but if it meant saving Rick, it might have to be done. "We have some food," Maggie said slowly, "and I have a few things, but I need to know. What is it you really want? What's the price?" The woman glanced up at her, a glimmer of something dark in her eyes. "You're not the first people to come here asking for help. And you won't be the last. We're trying to survive just like you. What's the point of keeping people alive if they don't give something in return?" Maggie swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "We'll do whatever we can. Just, please, help him." The woman hesitated, her eyes lingering on Maggie's face for a moment before turning back to Rick. "I'm going to help him," she said. "But it won't be for free. If you want to stay here, you'll have to prove your worth. Nothing's guaranteed, though." We've had too many people make promises, only to turn on us later. She paused, letting her words sink in. So, here's the deal. You can stay for now, but once Rick's stabilized, we'll expect you to work. You can help out around the shelter, find more supplies, and contribute to the community. And if you want to stay long-term, you'll need to earn your place. Otherwise, you'll be out on your own again. Maggie nodded, swallowing her pride. It wasn't ideal, but it was a chance. A small one, but it was enough. Rick's breathing was steadier now, though he was still pale and weak. The woman worked with precision, stitching up his wounds and administering antibiotics to stave off infection. It was a grueling, delicate process, but Maggie stayed by Rick's side the entire time, watching and waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag. "He'll live," she said, her tone slightly softer now. "For now, at least. You've got a few hours before we can really assess how he's doing." Relief washed over Maggie like a tidal wave, and she collapsed onto the floor beside Rick, her muscles aching from the strain of the last few hours. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding onto until now. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at the woman who had saved Rick's life. "You don't know how much this means to me." The woman simply nodded, her face unreadable. "I know. But don't forget. This is just the beginning. Surviving out there is harder than ever. And you'll need more than just medicine to stay alive." Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They weren't just surviving the apocalypse, they were surviving each other. For now, they were safe. But the price of that safety would be high. And Maggie knew, deep down, that this fragile truce would soon be tested in ways she couldn't even imagine. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and tentative relief. Maggie stayed at the shelter with Rick, helping as much as she could in exchange for the care he received. The woman, whose name turned out to be Anna, was practical, never offering more than what was necessary. Her attention to Rick's recovery was meticulous, but Maggie could see that there were deeper layers to this place, attention that lay just beneath the surface of every conversation, every glance exchanged. The shelter wasn't what Maggie had imagined when she first arrived. There were no warm, welcoming faces. The survivors here were hardened, their trust earned through deeds rather than words. They weren't cruel, but they were guarded, and for good reason. Each person here had their own story, their own losses, and Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that survival meant something different to each of them. Rick's condition improved slowly but steadily. The fever broke after a couple of days, his skin becoming less clammy, his breathing stronger. But Maggie knew that the worst was still ahead. They had a roof over their heads now, but food was still scarce, and the constant threat of walkers loomed over them like a shadow. On the fourth day, Maggie was asked to venture out with two other survivors, Hank, the man who had been standing guard when they arrived, and Lucas, a quiet, wiry man with a sharp gaze. Their mission was simple: gather supplies. The shelter had been running low on food and water, and they needed to restock if they were going to survive the coming weeks. Maggie wasn't thrilled about the idea. Her trust was still tentative, especially with the way Anna had kept a careful distance from her, making it clear that the shelter wasn't just a haven, but a trading post, a place where survival meant not just keeping the walkers at bay, but managing the fragile balance between people. "Stay close, and don't take any unnecessary risks," Hank said, his tone gruff. "We're not going out there to make friends." Maggie nodded, gripping the rifle she had been given. They were heading into a city center that had once been bustling with life, now reduced to an overrun ghost town, a war zone filled with not just the dead, but other survivors, desperate, ruthless people who were willing to kill for anything. As they stepped outside the shelter, Maggie was hit with the sharp contrast of the outside world. The air was thick with tension, the sky a dull, bruised gray, as if it too had given up. The streets were eerily quiet, and the absence of life seemed to amplify the groans of distant walkers. The group moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick dirt and broken glass beneath their boots. They hadn't walked far before the first sign of trouble came. A small group of walkers stumbled into view, their gurgling moans cutting through the silence. There were only 4 of them, But Maggie's heart rate spiked, and her grip tightened on the rifle. They could easily take them out, but that wasn't the problem. The real danger was the unpredictability of the city. Other survivors could be anywhere. "We take them quietly," Lucas whispered. Hank nodded, and the three of them split, surrounding the walkers with the practiced ease of people who had been through this hundreds of times. It took mere seconds to take them down, quick, efficient, and quiet. The walkers never had a chance. But just as they were about to move on, a shout echoed from behind them. "Hey!" Maggie spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw a group of survivors, 3 men, armed with knives and bats, emerging from an alleyway a few yards away. They looked desperate, eyes wild, clothes ragged. The kind of people you didn't want to cross in this world. "Hands up," one of them shouted, holding a knife out. "That food's ours now." "And the guns. Give it up." Maggie froze, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get back to the shelter. But the men were blocking their path. She could feel the weight of the situation, the pressure building as the leader of the group took a few steps forward, brandishing his knife like a trophy. "What are you gonna do, huh?" the man sneered. "You're just gonna walk away with our supplies, like we don't need them too." Hank raised his rifle, but Lucas put a hand on his arm, his expression tense but composed. "We don't want any trouble. We just need to get back to our shelter." The man's grin widened, a predator sensing weakness. "That's exactly the kind of answer I like to hear," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But that's not how this works. Hand over the weapons. All of them." Maggie's blood ran cold. The gun in her hand felt suddenly too heavy, too worthless against these men. They were willing to kill for what they wanted, and she could see the glint in their eyes. There was no negotiating here. With a sharp exhale, she made a decision. She lowered her rifle slowly, deliberately. "We're not looking for a fight," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, but her eyes scanned the men, looking for the slightest shift, a clue to what their next move might be. But it wasn't enough. The leader took another step closer, his knife raised now, and that was the signal. Without warning, he lunged at Hank. Maggie's heart slammed into her chest as the world seemed to slow. Time stretched, and she watched in horror as Hank grappled with the man, the knife flashing dangerously close to his side. But Hank was fast. He kicked the man back with a grunt, and before the others could react, he fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, but it was the only way to survive. One of the other men dropped, the shot hitting him square in the chest. The remaining 2 hesitated, eyes darting from their fallen comrade to the barrels of the guns in their faces. They weren't stupid. They knew they'd lost. "Get back," Hank warned, his voice steely. "We'll leave you alive, but if you take another step, we won't hesitate." The 2 men backed off, eyes burning with hatred but fear keeping them in check. They retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Maggie's chest tightened as the adrenaline surged through her. She had almost lost them. They had almost been overrun by people more dangerous than the walkers. This world was turning them into something else entirely, survival at any cost, no matter the cost to their humanity. As the 3 of them moved on, the weight of what had just happened settled over them like a dark cloud. They had fought for their lives again. But what if next time, they weren't so lucky? What if the breaking point was closer than they realized? They didn't speak as they walked back to the shelter, their minds too clouded with the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a storm on the horizon, something that would change everything. And when they returned to the shelter, Anna's eyes were waiting for them. The price for survival had been paid once again. But Maggie knew, deep down, that the real price was yet to come. And they would have to face it, together or not at all.